What we specialize in is what Buckminster Fuller would refer to as a phenomenon in life, which is to try to be anti-entropic, which means to try to put order into chaos. And what I mean by that is basically one of our core strengths is analytics and a quantitative approach to various different facets and industries. So we have a finance team, we do equity research, and we also do marketing, and we also do business intelligence. And the one single thread that holds everything together is the understanding of how to build models in overall chaotic systems. So if you're investing in the stock market, what model and approach can you implement that is extremely rational and does not accentuate any cognitive biases in order to identify great opportunities? If you're doing marketing, are you doing traditional marketing, which is billboards where you cannot quantify the approach, or are you going to do digital marketing where you're able to do things like A/B tests, where you're able to determine the customer acquisition costs and gradually refine the process to build a great sales funnel? If you're doing business analytics, how are you looking at the inefficiencies to that business? What systems can you implement, and how can you help directors of those businesses identify value within their bottom line or their margins? Okay, so from a strategic standpoint, I like to reference Josh Waitzkin. He is a world champion chess player. He was the motivation for the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer. And one of the interesting books that he wrote, which is called The Art of Learning, he discusses about thinking about the end game. Okay, so if you're doing business in any shape or form, what you need to envision is that exit, that term sheet, for example, and what would the various terms within that term sheet look like, when you're selling your equity in your business. And ultimately, what do you need to do to get there? So you just mentioned that Vietnam is a very chaotic environment, and I know that you talk a lot about having foreigners come in to Vietnam and trying to do business, and how basically if they can offer that competitive advantage, that it would be a very viable environment to do so. So when you think about Vietnam would fit into one of those markets where you would have a lot of millionaires, maybe potential billionaires, that would be segmented into what you would call like bad millionaires and billionaires, because most of their success is due to their different relationships, due to the economic structure of Vietnam. So if you're going to come in as a new player without, say, those relationships, how can you build a competitive advantage? And are you envisioning the end game? And are you able to backwardize that end game to your current starting point? And how can you build a competitive advantage that allows you to be successful in this market? And what are skill sets that you can bring into this market that other people don't offer? So what we noticed in Vietnam is statistics actually only recently has actually become like a major, and maybe only recently could you get your master's thesis on it. Very few people are prominent when it comes to statistics, which is actually surprising because it's a very common thing that you would see the world over. But in Vietnam, it's still relatively new. We also noticed digital marketing. There is no formal education for digital marketing in Vietnam. Everything that people know here is very ad hoc, and there's an information arbitrage that exists because all the innovations in digital marketing maybe are being developed in the West in English and are only gradually trickling into Vietnam. So if you're gonna find that competitive advantage, you've got to identify where various different weak points exist, and you've got to emphasize those to build your own kind of like moat. My major, how about that? Because that's even more important than your first job. My major was in information systems and human behavior.
Okay.
It's a multidisciplinary study, which works out very nice because you're able to extrapolate concepts and ideas. It mixes some social sciences with basically IT. Now, during that period of time, we've witnessed basically two financial crises, right? Basically in the 2000s and 2007. And then the question was like, why are stocks going down? So my journey then was like, how do I understand stock market behavior with my background? So it's not going to be from a finance perspective. It's going to be, how do you analyze stocks using a quantitative approach? How can you write a program that allows you to analyze that?
So you approached finance and stocks first from the systems and behavioral side.
Correct.
Not from finance.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is, part of that is you're also learning some of the social sciences.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about social sciences is that they're not very binary. There's many different schools of thoughts in terms of economics, in terms of psychology, in terms of philosophy, in terms of even business. How do you approach these things? And then, since these are all arts, how do you implement a model that can allow you to be successful? And I think that encapsulates, say, like maybe a decade journey of going, so what are the better business people doing? What are the better investors doing? What are the better economists doing? And all of those are all interconnected, because ultimately an individual, or in my case, say I was doing a business, that's on a very micro level. But by you playing the micro game, which is what I've been doing, say, for the last, say, decade or 15 years, then you also need to understand the macro game. And you can go forwards and backwards, understanding the macro and the micro. And then when you have a good understanding of both, think about the whole chess thing, going back to Josh Waitzkin, is you start from the end, right? Mm-hmm. Can you ensure that you understand how to go all the way back to your first few moves on the chessboard? Many people will learn how to play chess from the beginning, right, as opposed to thinking of it from the end. Yeah. But ultimately, your result is what you're going to see at the end. So what you need to do is you need to be well versed in the beginning and the end, and you can start from the end to understand the beginning. So basically, that's part of this journey, or at least the methodical way to think about it. And I think that's what I want to emphasize for the audience. And I know that this is gonna be a conversation, and maybe we're talking about providing advice. Mm-hmm. And what I'm doing is, if you think about it, some of the best advice is you're having basically a conversation with yourself in the past, right? This is how I would talk to myself if it was about 15 years ago. Hey, Peter, think about like building systems, think about models, and ultimately the audience is the benefactor of listening to something like this.
Right, sure.
A lot can be learned from the principles of game theory, right? And basically thinking about every move that you make in business, in life, as some kind of like tree diagram, and observing the various different permutations and probabilities when you're developing that kind of strategy. So there's going to be a lot of unpredictable events that happen as you go through the course of your entrepreneurial career. It's just the kind of choices that you're going to make based on the options that you have available, or maybe unavailable to you, that will determine what would ultimately be success or failure. I don't think I've envisioned like to be sitting here with you today. I never planned for that, but there were certain things and elements that put us here today based on many things that we've done in our past. And that's why we somehow have created this serendipity.
Absolutely. Okay.
Money is almost like a hot potato game, and the last guy that's going to hold up, get the potato is going to be kind of like the loser. Mm-hmm. It's going to be the guys that are the closest to the central banks that are going to be the benefactors of that. So if you're in financial services, that inherently puts you closer to where all this quantitative easing is occurring. So the main foundation of the business was a focus on financial services, and then how to help other financial institutions, and then how to help enterprises, for example, enter Vietnam successfully, as there's been very few case examples of successful foreign investment into Vietnam. Vietnam seems to be almost like a money pit as far as investment is concerned. You rarely hear about success stories, and that goes back to probably the approaches and strategies that they're implementing. And what we try to do is hopefully try to identify a successful business model that is anti-fragile to various different major macro or economic policies from a government or a centrally planned government that sets out an economic plan every 5 years. Yeah, sure. So everyone talks about the wonders of e-commerce in Vietnam and its fantastic double-digit growth rates. The reality is that for most companies that are selling products of value over $300, the consumer still needs to touch and feel the product. And that doesn't necessarily mean from a home delivery standpoint. It means that I need to go to the store. I need to basically see you unbox, basically in an unboxing video, with the warranty attached onto the product for me to feel comfortable in making the purchase. So what's interesting is when I take a look at the financials of retailers, for example, say you're an electronic retailer, how you are classifying what's considered e-commerce and what you are classifying as basically brick and mortar sale. And they kind of coincide with each other, and different organizations will classify the source or the point of the sale differently. So it's actually quite ambiguous. But if you understand that that is the nature of the consumer here in Vietnam, then what you're going to do is see how you can create some interesting funnels that can bring you both online and then offline conversion. And then you have to think about it. The more pricier the product, potentially the more lucrative the project that you're doing is. And some of the interesting spaces are like in financial services. Okay, so in Vietnam, one of the bigger industries is a sector called consumer finance. Consumer finance is all the rage. Effectively what it is basically I could go to a store and say I don't have enough money. As long as I have proof of employment, I can go to one of these quote unquote consumer finance companies and basically take out a high interest loan in order to purchase my product. Typically, we're looking at maybe 35% interest, right. And there are consumers that are happy to buy that because they consider the value of the phone, for example, could be worth it, and it could give them the social status that they need. So they'll buy the iPhone, pay 35% per annum interest rate for that, and some company, which has a special license, can provide them that loan. Now, it's a $15 billion industry, and it's a rapidly growing industry. In Vietnam.
15 billion.
Correct. Wow. And it is continuing to grow, and it's having a larger presence in all the major retailers here in Vietnam. So if you wanted to exploit the quote-unquote consumer demographic, which everyone talks about notoriously, there are maybe ancillary ways to benefit from that, such as in financial services, such as in consumer finance. Now, there's very few companies that actually can obtain the license. You obviously have to have the relationships to do so. But what companies are successfully building the channel, the funnel, and who truly understands the copy, the whole approach to bringing a client online all the way to the point where they're walking in to your location and saying, hey, I want to open an account with you guys. Okay. And if you can master some of these niches, it can be extremely interesting. And those are some of the spaces that we're focused on. And maybe for any of the guys that are doing marketing that are listening to this, they're probably just like, I don't really know what this is. It makes no sense to me. I'd rather just sell Coca-Cola. But good luck, because companies like multinationals have only a select amount of agencies that they're going to go with, and you're going to have to bid for those projects. But those are probably the ones that are very competitive. And this is the blue oceans that I'm talking about, as opposed to these red bloody waters. Right. Wow, this is an interesting question. So, is the mistake spending all of this time building a fantastic economic moat in a country with a population of 90 million people or 93 million people, with a GDP of basically 126 billion, and maybe a salary rate of $2,000 per capita? Is that the most expensive mistake? Because you can, in theory, apply many of the things that we discussed about in much more developed markets and maybe be capturing a much larger sum of overall revenues. So the expensive mistake is perhaps the opportunity cost. And then it's a question about time and what you're doing with your time. And are you able to find some compelling, distinct advantages? So Vietnam offers some advantages, and people talk about them, but the question is, are they appropriately utilizing them? So here's an example. With Phoenix Capital, we have a bunch of financial experts. Some of them are foreign educated, but they've never had the opportunity to fully utilize their education about financial services or financial analysis, because the market here is way too early stage for you to be talking about very complex aspects. And what happens for individuals that go to school internationally or domestically and they go through their university learning about all these different advanced financial products is that once they go into the job force, if they're not being able to practice and exercise their knowledge, then maybe they become a little bit more stale. So what we offer at this organization is that because we have a multinational client base, we're able to test the limits of your education and your background. And very few organizations can offer that. And if you're able to test someone's background, and you're probably one of the only shops in-house here in Vietnam that are doing something like this, then perhaps the opportunity is working internationally and being equally as viable as like a big four entity around the region. And that's the arbitrage.
Okay.
But how can you continue to develop and build that business? So we're at an interesting nexus right now where we have all this amazing infrastructure here in Vietnam. And some of the clients that we love to deal with are international clients because our work is internationally comparable. And as you know, it's probably very hard to maintain quality here that would not be distinguishable amongst stuff that you would see in the West. But what we're doing now is just outreaching towards maybe foreign direct investors, investors that are interested in investing throughout the region, that are looking for advisors, thinking about how they're going to grow their business, make it into a multinational business. And those are the things that we're able to do out of Vietnam, which is an interesting journey. And then sometimes you have to assess, once again, the opportunity cost that you took by spending time here. But I think I compensate for that by still trying to contribute things internationally. As you know, we have this podcast, the Big Trade Series. We talk to Nobel Prize winners. We talk to aspiring, investors and world-renowned investors and, presidential candidates like Ron Paul. So it's an interesting journey, but you have to find your niche.
Okay. Well, there's two things I want to talk about here, and they're both equally as interesting to me. First of all, you just talked about the opportunity cost of being in Vietnam directly after saying niching down into specific parts for your services is how you have an advantage.
Right.
Perhaps niching into Vietnam is one of those advantages. I guess the other question then is when, right? Because you said the opportunity cost is how much time you spend here in order to realize that opportunity.
Right.
Right. The second thing about the podcast, since you brought it up, where did the podcast come from? Because it's called the Big Trade, right?
Right.
Which is also the title of a book you wrote.
Correct.
So tell us about that.
Okay. So going back to your first question is the when, right? And I think in order to manage my sanity that's why we had to find like the niches ASAP and try to implement them. Some of it may be a little early as far as market development is concerned. Some of it's just the perfect time right now. But as I said, when you're trying to build an anti-fragile business, you cannot, in this country especially, use the word when. You cannot be dependent on certain catalysts to happen because that could take forever. So you've got to make sure whatever it is that you're applying is applicable now. Because at the end of the day, you have to put food on the table. You have to generate revenue. I look at my P&L, say, for example, on a monthly basis. So we got to make sure that these ideas, which might sound conceptual right now or might sound theoretical, have that applicable application from a commercial respect. And that's what we've been doing. As far as the content is concerned, we believe that's also a major competitive advantage. Because how many people, as you mentioned, are doing podcasts? How many people are doing books? How many people are even thought leaders out of Vietnam from an international perspective? So what we offer to clients is, once again, something that is internationally comparable from a thought leaders, from a think tank, basically, that's doing some interesting R&D, relatively innovative, but also pragmatic to the current conditions of the market. That's a very rare composition. And not only are we just doing this for the sake of doing it, because anyone can self-publish a book. As you know, many people can do a podcast, but we try, or at least we strive to make sure that it's internationally comparable. So this book that's published by Wiley was published internationally. Then it got published in Vietnam. It sold about 5,000 copies internationally, translated by the University of Shanghai Finance and Economics. It was like a top seller on Amazon. It covers the quantitative approaches to building models. And the podcast has, like I mentioned, reputable people such as Nobel Prize winners, renowned investors like Jim Rogers, Doug Casey, renowned newsletter writers like Porter Stansberry, Ron Paul, a libertarian thought leader, on the podcast as well. And then sometimes really quirky guys that have really interesting insight. That is probably another way to keep sanity, but also to make sure that we are contributing and you don't just get stuck in the nexus of Vietnam.
Right.
I think that it is taking, I have a wild imagination, and it is one of man's great successes to take your thoughts and ideas and transform the world around you, and then have the world around you transform you through some fantastic feedback loop. A strategist named John Boyd, he has a strategy, military strategy called OODA loop, which is observe and orient, and ultimately then decide and take action. And what I've seen in Vietnam was, when I came here, I just worked at banking institutions, and I've managed to transform myself and transform my own environment, my whole world, through these ideas and hard work. And what allows you to do that is to basically try to tap into your maximum potential. Stephen Kotler wrote a book called The Rise of Superman. And the idea of that book is to tap into this state of flow. And if you can get into a state of flow, which is like, as athletes will call it, being in the zone. If you can get in the zone and be there for as long as time as possible, you will achieve incredible things. And then when you have a team of people that understand that vision, you can add scale to that. And that is probably one of the things that inspires me, which is to become basically the best version of myself as possible. And there's no limit to that. And every day that you practice your craft and hone into that, you're just becoming better and more better than the competition. And that proves itself, obviously, through the growth and the success of your business. Because that's another feedback loop that you're getting too. So I could be a complete heretic saying all this stuff, but I know that, we have clients. Our clients are satisfied. We're making revenue from this. We're a profitable business. Mm-hmm. So that's some feedback loop. But you constantly have to improve. And that's what inspires me, to be the best person that I possibly can be. And what was interesting was, when I was in Canada, you're a minority. So I'm Canadian Vietnamese, basically, right? And people, the financial industry there is very Anglo-Saxon based as well. So most of the people in top of this, the industry are like that. And there's basically glass ceilings. But, spending all this time and focus on being the best version of yourself, you've effectively broken glass ceilings. And what's interesting is that because you've become a better person, even the perception that other people have of you is completely different. So if you were talking to me maybe 15 years ago, you're like, who is this guy? Right? And I think that's the message. But for some reason, not a lot of people have that goal, and not a lot of people are on that path for whatever reason. And it affects their whole life. Because let's say I'm only interested in finding a lover, for example. And if I haven't self-actualized, then my relationship with other people is going to be very different. So when you watch movies like James Bond and Mission Impossible, and you see these guys that are basically like alpha males that completely dominate the moment, and people are attracted to them and magnetized to them. So there's something quite interesting to say, hey, what if we could try to be the best person that we can be? How would the world treat us? And I've seen that feedback loop, and it's fantastic. And if other people were on that path, we could create some really amazing things.